Hey, good afternoon. This is Colin Glover from Sarah Bren. Alexi Johnson is on the line, and I also have a special guest today, Terry Reese. We're continuing our coverage of the CMMC requirements in the various domains, and today we're heading on audit and accountability. So welcome, everyone. So, if you've attended these before, you've interacted with us, you know about Sarah Bren. We are a FedRAMP 3PAO. We do conduct audits and assessments under the FedRAMP guidelines. We're a PCI QSA. We do a lot of work in the cyber risk management field and really help a lot of companies understand their requirements and obligations depending on what regulations or other frameworks they have to adhere to. So we do specialize a lot with higher education and defense industrial base. All right, and as Alexi mentioned in the chat, y'all may not be paying attention to that. If you have questions, please feel free to hit us up anytime, either via the chat window. There's also a question window on there. Go ahead and hit us on that. So a couple of caveats. We can't provide you instructions on anything. If you may have particular scenarios or particular technologies within your environment, and we don't know it from here. So this is a general guidance only. If you do have specific questions, you're welcome to ask them. However, we may not know the answer off the top of our head. Please follow up with us afterwards. There's always going to be multiple methods to implement anything. There is no one-size-fits-all. You may have to be creative within your environment. All right. I've got a note on here that says review NIST SP 800-171A. 171A is the audit guide for 171. If you had a chance, the CMMC assessment guide was leaked. I don't know how accurate that is, but the assessment guide was based off of 171A. So I would become very familiar with that audit guide. It is a bit more detailed than what you would anticipate, so please take a look at that. All right, so we'll get started. Alexi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. I'm glad you're not on mute.
Okay. Great.
All right, Alexi. So what is audit and accountability?
So audit and accountability really is just a system of processes and procedures that are designed to know who had access to something and when, with the goal of being able to provide potential evidence or information to be used to help investigate any potential actions that are taken in an environment.
And for that matter, why is it important?
For that very reason. There are many different things that happen across an environment, and it's very important to be able to trace those things out to determine, really the 5 W's for any potential incident or event that happens in your environment. The Department of Defense is always very interested if you were to have a breach or some type of data spillage, and this type of information that can be gained from audit logs can really be provided. It can help, determine at some degree, what happened and when.
Now, for this type of thing, I come across it occasionally. So if a server goes down, does the DoD care about that? Is that something that's considered an event?
Well, it depends. So every event should at some point be investigated to determine if an event is something that should be classified as an incident, but just the server going down in and of itself, not necessarily something that the Department of Defense cares about. But if in the review of these audit logs, you discovered that there was some malicious attempt or malicious actor that was at play, then that's where they may want to know about that.
Okay. All right, and so the $5 million question is, where do you start?
Well, the first thing you always do is you identify, what the technology that you have in play, whether your Windows systems, do you have any servers, your network devices, and then you want to determine what capabilities exist when you're dealing with this, because some things have the ability to do a little bit more auditing. Some things may not have that many auditing functions or capabilities that exist. But I believe our first webinar was on access control, and one of the things that's come from access control and configuration management is that the inventory of what you have is always the most important thing. So discovering what you have in your environment is going to lead you into determining what you need to be doing from an auditing standpoint.
Now, those systems that I have, whether it be a Windows system, isn't the default good enough?
The default in some cases may be good enough if security is not your goal, but I would say that if you want to be more secure, you definitely want to take a look, and it's actually a CMMC and a NIST 800-171 requirement. You want to actually review what's being audited in your environment and make any necessary updates to that. Just as a for example, you may have one file share that has CUI, and you may actually want to turn on additional auditing just for all the files and folders that exist in that environment. It doesn't just have to be at the operating system level. You should be making determinations on what levels of auditing you want to exist across the board.
Now, and I'm sure most people on here are aware, but where would I go to find this kind of information?
Well, there's lots of free information out there. In preparation for today, I actually have a couple of links that I'm going to share. But Microsoft actually publishes recommendations for auditing. I know that the majority of the enterprise uses Microsoft, so that's why I mentioned that, and I will be sharing those links in the webinar. But also, as shown on the slide, the Center for Internet Security published some benchmarks that have lots of security best practices that are published based on a variety of operating systems and different types of devices. So I actually have that link as well that I'm going to be providing right now. So if you're able to see the chat, you'll see a link to the CIS benchmark. So whether it's Windows, whether it's Apple, Linux, whatever the flavor of operating system you have, you can find some very good information that's very detailed in how to configure it so that you can get a more secure environment.
And I think we may hit upon it a bit later, but just in general, so you have your Windows devices. Say your routers and your VPNs and your switches and your firewalls, is it all the same there?
Absolutely. You definitely want to be logging those types of devices as well, because I know we like to think that our administrators have a good handle on every device that's involved, and we think that we can trust all of our users. But quite frankly, you want to determine who has access to those devices and some of the specific functions that those devices can have, because if a malicious, person was to create another account on your network device and they log in and start setting up, back doors and things like that, being able to check your audit logs may key you into that. So every device in your environment should have some level of logging capability, and you want to be reviewing those logs.
And you mentioned reviewing those logs. And I think we may hit on this a bit, but are you just supposed to go to every machine and start looking at logs? That sounds hard.
So, that's a very good question. So we're primarily catering these webinars towards CMMC Level 3, but CMMC Level 4 adds in a little bit further requirement, but I'll speak to it from a 3 standpoint. You actually get the opportunity to decide in your environment the frequency and what type of review you want to do to your audit logs. So I think it would be very appropriate for you to, at a minimum, set up some levels of logging and alerting for your critical infrastructure devices, such as your firewalls or maybe a domain controller or file servers, where you want to review those logs a little bit more frequently. Maybe you could do a weekly review of those logs and have some established alerts for certain types of triggers, but maybe workstations, you could probably push that out a little bit further and not review them as frequently. And you could probably review them more reactively to situations that come up. But for your critical devices, there should definitely be some level of proactivity where you're setting an established battle rhythm of how often you're going to be looking at those logs.
All right, so I think we hit about level 3. So let's talk about what is actually required under CMMC. So I think we hit on this.
Well,
go ahead.
Yes. No, I was going to say the biggest thing is that second bullet there. Um, it's not necessarily auditing accountability. It more looks at access control and identification or authentication. But you want to make sure that every user has their own account and their own level of access. Many small businesses often make the mistake when they're trying to be DFARS compliant. They share an administrative account. Well, when you share an administrative account, yes, you can have some supplemental things that you do to be able to determine who did what and when. But trying to have a paper log to say, I use the domain admin account at any specific time, that's never a good idea. You want to make sure that everybody has their own account so that any action that they take can be tied uniquely to them, so that if you have to do an investigation, you're not trying to figure out who did what and when, or trying to review paper logs to figure that out. So that's always your very first step.
And one of the things that I've heard of is oftentimes on, say, non-Windows devices, some of the network devices, they may just have the one account on there. Is that allowed?
You know, there are scenarios where you can have one account on there. What I tell most clients is that it depends on how many people are going to be administering that device. If you're going to have multiple people administering that device, you may want to have multiple accounts on it. But if it's only going to be one person administering the device, then you may be okay with one account. But you have to be able to uniquely trace those actions back to any person or any individual. So if it's one person, you may be okay. But if you have multiple administrators administering a device, it's a best practice to definitely have multiple accounts if the device can support it.
Yeah, and so when you say administrator, I got a question about that. Maybe I just have the one IT guy who administers everything, but you know, it's my company, I own the device, so I want passwords for everything. So I've got a password to that device, you know, in case that guy leaves or something. I mean, I don't administer it, but is that all right?
You know, that's always a touchy topic. In an event like that, if the device can support it, it may be a better idea to keep a break glass type of password set up that maybe the standard administrator has his own account, and then you have that other account that you can keep to yourself, so that if that person leaves and you have to say, all right, I need to set somebody else up, now you go through that process with that alternate account. I understand the thought behind why people want the same account, but just because you get the opportunity to use it, it's always best to have as much non-repudiation as you can, which basically says, I know that this person did it because they're the only one that had the password. But when you have the same person sharing a password with somebody else, nobody can definitively say who actually logged onto the system. Now, Terry may say otherwise, being the forensic expert that he is, but just as a general rule, it's always a good idea to have separate usernames and passwords.
Great, thank you. And so now we're going to bump on down to reviewing your logs, and we hit on this a little bit. So, you know, listed here are the requirements for CMMC. So the first one is collect logs to a central location. What's a general way of doing that?
You know, because I heard this from a client, I'm going to mention it. So I did have a client that said the way that they're going to do this is they're just going to have all of their logs. They're going to write a script. It's going to save all of their logs, and it's going to save it on a shared drive somewhere. And they're going to collect all of their logs centrally. I will tell you that that will work. However, as you walk down through these other options, you will see that that's not the most effective way of getting it done. So collecting those logs into a central location should require the use of some type of SIEM solution where you can aggregate all of your logs across all of your devices into one system that can correlate all of your logs from various. So it feeds into the second bullet point of correlating logs across the network. And then it also provides what's called audit reduction. When you look at audit logs, you can have thousands upon thousands of entries every single day. Well, the same solution will provide you a level of audit reduction so that you can easily parse through the information and have some report generating capability, which is also a requirement.
So yeah, I want to come back to, you know, you're talking about reviewing logs once a week for critical infrastructure. You know, it's not that somebody would actually sit there and scroll through the event log. Maybe they would use the reports that they generated from their SIM.
Absolutely. You can literally, in most SIM solutions, obviously, there are a variety of different companies who manufacture these types of products. But if you have domain controllers, say DC1, DC2, if you want to just see certain categories of alerts or certain categories of logs. You can set up reports that will just give you information solely for those devices.
Okay, great. And, with the SIM, and maybe it doesn't have to be a SIM, maybe you could use syslog, or not syslog, but a log repository with some additional functionality, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And the last bullet we have here is protecting your logs from modification and deletion. Why is that important?
Well, that's important because people can cover their tracks if they can, if they can basically let you. I'm sorry, I'm fumbling over my words. If they can cover their tracks, erasing the trail that says I was here, then it makes it easier for them to do something malicious in your environment. So you always want to make sure that your logs are in a position where a regular user or any potential malicious user can't just go in and edit them, modify them, because they can basically paint a different picture if they're able to modify these audit logs.
Okay, and so I think just in general, and we're going to jump over to Terry here in a second. What would be your number one piece of advice to address this control or address this domain?
I think the biggest thing that I would do is inventory, and then figure out what are the configurable options for auditing on every device that I have, and then take a good look and figuring out, okay, what do I need to configure, and actually setting those configurations, and then reviewing it from time to time, just so that you can make smart decisions based off of that. And when I say smart decisions, obviously we're gearing these webinars towards small businesses. So sometimes if you put a SIEM solution in place, you may be charged based on the amount of data that goes across. So that's where you may have to make a decision. Okay, I've turned it up a little too high. It's giving too much information, and I'm spending too much money. But once you set it and you tone it, then you should be able to have a pretty good product. But that's the biggest thing for it, is just figuring out what systems do I have, what auditable configurations do they have, document what you're going to set it, and then tune it over time, and then you should be good from there.
And we're going to ask Terry the same thing, because he may have different opinions. All right, so also, and we're going to jump over to Terry Reese. And Terry Reese is our forensics expert here at Sarah Bren, and he gets to spend a lot of his time looking at audit logs, trying to understand what occurred. So Terry, how important is logging when it comes to incident response?
So from my standpoint, they're absolutely critical. If I walk into a customer's network who's been breached, really the only way for me to determine what happened and how it happened and when it happened is going to be from the audit logging. If there aren't any audit logs, it makes the job infinitely harder. Okay.
So, and maybe we can step back a bit. So you walk into a company, they're having issues. Let's take ransomware, right? Everything's locked down. What's your first step there?
So ransomware is a tricky one.
Sure.
A lot of ransomware doesn't actually touch event log files in Windows, which is a good thing. But first thing I typically want to do is find out where the ransomware infection is coming from, who's patient zero. Most instances of ransomware, there's some sort of authentication to SMB shares across a network for that particular ransomware to go out and find files it has write access to, encrypt those files, and lock that data down so they can get some money out of you for it. So looking at audit logs, event logs are going to be one of the first things I want to go to figure out, where am I seeing weird logins from? Am I seeing administrative accounts logging in across, 25, 30 different machines in the span of a few seconds? Am I seeing, a single user account logging into a bunch of different machines in the span of a few seconds? There's a lot of things like that I would want to see. And again, that goes back to audit logging. If that audit log isn't there, it makes it that much more difficult to try to parse out.
Sure. And so we'll flip it a bit, and let's talk about what the DoD cares about, which is accessing sensitive data. If there's no logging there, can you actually tell what a bad guy accessed?
No.
So,
I mean, pretty much, yeah. There may be some roundabout ways to do it, but typically if the audit log isn't intact, the security log, particularly for like Windows, if that is being overwritten, doesn't have enough storage space to go back in history far enough, It's next to impossible to find out what's been accessed by who and
Sure.
then tie that to any specific user.
And so if, say you were coming in from the DoD side or something, and this company had been breached, it's been breached, but there's no logs, what would you have to assume? Would you assume everything's gone?
Yeah, at that point, it's you almost get into a no trust situation where you don't know where things came from, you don't know what happened. You can't really tie it down to, okay, this user was phished, their credentials were compromised, and that was the initial foothold for an attacker. You really can't answer a lot of the key questions that need to be answered in an incident response scenario that can, kind of limit, okay, this is the chain of events that happened. This slice of devices have been compromised, these other devices are safe. The remediation actions become much larger, down the line if you can't really pare that stuff down with some of the audit logging to say, only these devices were affected, the rest of this network is okay, let's just rebuild these and make sure, we go through and check everything else, but it just expands the scope of work quite a bit.
So really without good logging, you're almost at a rip and replace.
Yes, and we've seen that. We've been in scenarios where, audit logging just was not available. Typically, we see a lot of organizations that don't send their firewall logs to syslog server, and it's just writing to memory. And, in an incident response scenario, we may have to go back a week, 2 weeks, a month. Most firewalls only write to buffer for maybe anywhere from 12 to maybe 24 hours if you're lucky, depending upon the amount of network traffic going through. So if we only have 12 hours worth of logs and the incident took place a week ago, we can't really determine what happened.
All right. And how often do you come across that?
That's unfortunately fairly common, particularly with firewalls. A lot of times we see Windows logs that aren't configured to have a larger event log size or any sort of backing up of that event log. Typically, it's better to get those event logs off of those servers and into some sort of SIM or some sort of log repository, so there is some basically that make sure that the logs are intact and haven't been modified or touched by anyone else. It is actually possible to modify event logs, which is something that came out a couple years ago with an NSA leak. But getting those logs into a central repository away from the servers, if that server is ransomed or it's shut down for whatever reason, you may lose that data. So getting it out of there and getting it into a place where you can review it later is definitely critical. And
just from a pain perspective, all right, say you'd have a simple phishing and simple email compromise, right? If they had good logging turned on, how long would it take you to rectify that situation?
Pretty quickly. I mean, that's really like Office 365, for example. Provided mailbox auditing is enabled, which it is by default for most customers now. That data's there. You can pull the logs out and kind of get an idea of what happened relatively quickly. Sometimes it gets a little dicey when you have multiple accounts compromised and you have to go through a lot of different logs, but it definitely speeds up the process overall, rather than trying to kind of put pieces of the puzzle together where you're missing parts of the puzzle. You have all the information. You can kind of come up with a timeline of events of what happened a lot quicker.
Okay. So the reverse side of that is without logging, how much longer would it take you?
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah. So sometimes it's, especially if you have like a larger network breach, say 100 endpoints, someone got inside, you have a ransomware situation, trying to identify out of those 100 endpoints which one was the one who opened a malicious attachment and fired off the ransomware. Sometimes that's really difficult to trace down without that log data.
Now, and I think we hit on this just a bit, with some of these, if they were bringing out the logs to a SIM or some other sort of log repository, are they going to, especially with the SIM or an automated alerting system, is it going to reduce the impact of the breach? It may not prevent it.
I think it's gonna help you identify it faster, and that's really the trick. The longer an attacker dwells in your network, the more damage they can do, and conversely, along with that, the price ends up going up in terms of how to remediate that. Being able to have some sort of automated alerting system to say, hey, there's an administrative account logging into all the machines at 2 o'clock in the morning when it shouldn't be, that's something that would be flagged in a SIM type situation. Having that, sort of information coming in would allow you to identify it a lot quicker. It may not reduce the damage depending upon how fast the attacker is moving, but at least gives you, you start getting to a point where minutes are critical of trying to figure out what's going on, and that at least gets you ahead of the game in terms of responding and shutting down whatever activity is happening.
Now, is SIM something that you can set and forget?
No. SIMs they do require a bit of care and feeding. Just as new attacks evolve, they may not, identify things that are new. But once you get all your logging in there, that's really that's the long pole in the tent. Is getting all the devices to feed the logs into the SIM, and then figuring out what sorts of things are normal, what sorts of things are abnormal. And that's really kind of the heavy lifting up front for a SIM, and then there is some care and feeding as you go along. But
And so whether it be a SIM or some other sort of log repository for Windows systems, and I don't think we talked about it, is it something you can just tell Windows to do? Is it that easy?
Yeah, I mean, if you have like a domain and group policy, you can configure logging through group policy, what events are audited, how those are put in there, and then a lot of times with SIMs, there ends up being some sort of agent or log forwarding set up to get those logs over to a SIM.
It does. Yeah. Okay. And so typically you're looking at something like Splunk or Logarithm or something like that. Okay. But it can get real expensive real quick, right?
They can, yeah, and that's Alexi hit on this earlier. Is at a certain point, depending upon the size of your network, you do have to kind of start deciding these are the events that I really want to see, these are the events that I don't want to see, and critical things like log-ons, log-offs, resource access, things like that are going to be what you really want to see.
Account changes,
password changes, particularly disabled accounts being enabled, or a random user account being added to a domain administrator group. These are all red flags that would definitely make me want to look further into what changes are being made on my network.
Okay, great. And I think our last question is, we have the Microsoft 360. Are there other things that you think people should generally be doing?
Well, so
maybe that's not well known, or
so with Microsoft 365, Office 365, so there were some issues back in late 2018, early 2019 with mailbox auditing, and particularly business email compromise or phishing attacks type scenarios. Microsoft decided in early 2019 to turn on mailbox auditing for all users, all customers, because it would give a little bit greater insight in terms of, when an attacker did log into a user's mailbox, what mailbox items did they access, what sort of data did they download, things like that. And what that does is it allows someone like me to determine, this is the scope of the breach, these are the type of items that were accessed. Are there any notification requirements to say that, any sort of PII or other sensitive data had been accessed or stolen? So the mailbox auditing being turned on was a big deal, and for Microsoft for doing that. One thing to note, though, is that if you have E5 licenses, those mailbox audit items will show up in your event log searches. If you have an E3 or E1 license, they don't show up by default, and you have to enable mailbox auditing per user mailbox. And there are PowerShell tools out there that will allow you to do that. If you search for how to enable mailbox auditing in Office 365, there are some really good guides out there on how to do that.
Awesome. Anything else you can think of? Turn on logging is the...
Well, turn on logging, yeah. And from my standpoint, log as much as humanly possible, as much as you can get, much as you can retain. It's typically better just in terms of if you do run into the unfortunate circumstance of being breached, it will definitely help save you some money. It'll save time, and it'll typically get your business back on its feet faster if you have that data readily available.
And from going back to the cost point with SIM and data flow, I mean, you could push all your logs to central repository and then push up to your SIM from there.
True. Yes.
Right.
You can do
so
that.
You still have all your logs. You just get to pick and choose what you're sending.
Yes.
That costs money.
Yes. Yeah, and a lot of logging features have things like that built in. Like Splunk has some technologies where you can set up a forwarder that will forward logs before it gets to the main Splunk indexing servers, and it lets you parse out, let's take these event IDs out because they're really not useful in terms of a security standpoint. They're just kind of general Windows events that happen. but you can filter that stuff out and kind of pick and choose what you want to see as it goes up.
But for traditional small business, is that really a concern? Are they going to be pushing gigs and gigs every day?
Typically, no. It would be definitely an out of the ordinary event if they were pushing that kind of data, but that would also be a red flag that there's a bigger issue.
Yeah, and so just monitoring network traffic is helpful, right?
Yes, yeah.
You know, if you're typically pushing half a gig and all of a sudden you're doing 5,
yes,
that'd be a problem.
That would be a pretty good sign that someone is pulling data out of your network.
All right. So that's the end of our webinar for today. Pretty good timing. So we're going to open it up to questions. So there's the Q&A thing and there's the chat thing. If anybody has questions or concerns or points, let us know. And we'll hang out here for a couple minutes.
You know, I mentioned in the chat, this is Alexi again, I mentioned in the chat that, you know, with Terry online, Terry is a forensics expert. You know, he's been doing this type of work for a very long time. So any of those burning technical questions that you know, really have been wanting to know things about, Terry is probably a good person to be able to answer those questions. So this is really a good time to take advantage of the expertise that's on the call today. So if you have any questions, I definitely implore you to ask him at this time.
Yeah, we don't let him out very often, so that's a good point to ask him some questions.
Well, Terry, while nobody else is asking a question, you know, I'll ask one. So because you've been dealing with responding to emergencies and things like that, I know that we're not looking for Sarah Brin to make an endorsement on any particular product or anything like that. But just off the top of your head, you know, are there any relatively inexpensive, fairly easy to use products that maybe a company could look to as a decent option to support what their requirements are if they're not heavy on IT staff?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's actually a product called Checklight that we have that does a really good job of that. You know, it'll collect those logs for you, and it has some alerting features and things like that, and a very easy to use dashboard that you can take a look at to kind of help with that sort of thing.
I see that we do have a question. Do you see that question there?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if you can see that, Terry. Azure Sentinel.
Sentinel for us. So I would think, you know, the advantage of Sentinel over, you know, something like Logarithm is that it's you know, native. It's going to be incorporated into Microsoft's own portfolio of products. So it's going to have, you know, a little bit better understanding, I think, of some of the log data that's going to be coming in and the ability to ingest some of that log data without too much fine tuning. I always like native tools with native tools. So from that standpoint, Sentinel is pretty good.
Yeah, so. I mean, you know, I would compare it to CloudWatch or something like that. I mean, the AWS product works really well. So I would assume, compared to trying to offload into a traditional SIM.
Yeah.
I mean, from what we've seen thus far, Azure Sentinel seems to work pretty well, and I think it's less than Logarithm. For sure. Yeah, from a price point, I think it is. Yeah, so if you're in the Microsoft environment, particularly if you're using not just O365, but using some of the Azure capabilities, running some of the infrastructure in Azure, then Sentinel is certainly probably a good answer.
Yeah, it's a good tool. Some of the customers that use it, I've gotten good feedback from them. They like it. So.
All right, everyone. Thanks for attending today. If you have any follow-on questions or if you have any concerns, our contact information is here at the bottom, or you can reach out directly. Thank you, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon.